Okay, thanks very much, Ruben. And yeah, I mean, I think it's been a really excellent series of discussions, and in a way, this session sort of follows on from the previous sessions, and particularly the last session about working class representation and how working class people see themselves and how they get organised. So when we talk about reformists and revolutionaries, anybody who's been around the left for any time at all, which I know some of us haven't, but on the other hand, some of us have, you know that very often reformist is a term that is used as a sort of term of abuse among revolutionaries, and sometimes revolutionary is used as a term of abuse among reformists or among Labour Party people and things like that. Now, what I want to do today is to really explain what the basis of both of these terms is, and how really we as socialists, revolutionary socialists, people who want to change the system, how it is that we work within the wider movement and within the wider left. I want to start with talking a little bit about what reformism really is. I mean, when people think of reformism, it's usually in terms of support for the Labour Party, maybe working in a sort of gradual way from the trade unions, that kind of approach to politics. And we should understand this isn't just a kind of something that people kind of come on to by accident. If you look at reformism as a phenomenon inside the working class movement, what it really reflects is this. It reflects the fact that working class people are exploited and oppressed, and they don't like the system under which they live. They have all sorts of grievances and complaints about the system under which they live. At the same time, because of their condition of exploitation, they don't have the confidence, and they very often don't have the consciousness to overthrow the whole system. And therefore, what they set out to do is to improve the existing system without seeing the need that Chris was talking about, without seeing it as a totality, and without seeing the need to completely transform it. That is the essential nature of reformism under capitalism. And in Britain and many other countries, it has a very, very long tradition. I mean, you can go back, if you look even in the Chartist movement, you developed reformist wings and revolutionary wings, in the sense of the physical force and the moral force Chartists. If you look at the first trade union in this country, the first big trade union was Robert Owen's Grand National Consolidated Trade Union. There were those sorts of movements, an attempt to ameliorate the worst aspects of capitalism without necessarily confronting the need to completely overthrow it. And of course, if you look at the 20th century, I suppose you could say the 20th century is a sort of heyday or the high point of reformism, certainly in Britain and in Europe, where you have the development of trade unions, often on a mass scale, as we've seen in Britain, but also in many other countries, but also the development of large working class parties representing workers and increasingly representing them. I mean, if you look, Germany had the biggest one, and the German party was actually a party with a Marxist programme, was actually connected with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels up to his death in 1895. But parties which really gained their real purchase because of the advancement of the franchise for working class people. I mean, in this country, up until 1918, not only did no women have the vote, but large sections of working class men didn't have the vote either. And if you look at the development of the Labour Party, it's connected with that rise in the franchise, and it therefore replaces the Liberal Party, which was the second party of British capitalism up until 1918. It replaces it as the party which reflects and which speaks for the bulk of, certainly, of organised workers. It becomes, in Britain, it takes a particular form where it's created by the trade union movement, and it becomes the trade union's voice inside of Parliament. That is the express role of the Labour Party as far as the trade unions are concerned, which is why, and I'll come back to this later in the talk, which is why the present crisis over the link with Labour and so on is so important for both sides and for the future of reformist organisation in this country. Now, when you look at revolutionaries have a very different view, which is that they can see what is wrong with the, we all come to revolutionary politics because we don't like all sorts of aspects of the system, whether it's racism, whether it's the situation we're in at work, whether it's sexism, whether it could be a whole range of things that we're not happy with, the whole sort of class system and so on. We all come to revolutionary politics from different points, but one of the things that unites us is the idea that we can't simply we can improve our lives as within capitalism, but we can't actually achieve any form of real socialism or any kind of ending of exploitation and oppression without also creating a society based on production for need, not for profit, ending the profit system, ending private property, and so on and so forth. Now, it's by definition, if you look at capitalist society, until the time of the revolution, and the point that Chris was making in his talk, until the time of the revolution, revolutionaries are in the minority. Sometimes they're a big minority. If you look at whole periods in history, particularly the period from the Russian Revolution in 1917 up to the rise of fascism in Germany in 1933, you talk about in a number of countries, revolutionaries were very significant mass parties. For lots, and that has been true in some cases since then, but by and large, in the countries like Britain, revolutionaries have been fairly small groups of people. They've been in the minority, and this is part and parcel of the kind of analysis that we have, as opposed to the analysis of the reformists. And Rosa Luxemburg, who wrote a very good little book on this question called conveniently Reforming Revolution, who was a German, Polish actually, Polish-German, Jewish revolutionary who was a contemporary of Lenin and Trotsky and so on. She actually describes this as that you're not talking about just revolutionaries a little bit more extreme than reformists. She says it's not like just buying two different sorts of sausage and one's more spicy than the other. It's actually about that you have a different philosophy because you have a different goal. That if you're a reformist, you will settle for some improvement in society, some reforms in society. If you're revolutionary, you want a very, very different goal. So that's the way that she defines it. Now, that's the general picture, but of course the general picture doesn't really tell us that much about how you operate as a socialist in Britain in 2013, or come to that in Greece or Germany or anywhere else, in terms of the way that you operate. And therefore, the big question for revolutionary socialists is how do you work with people who are under the influence of reformist ideas? They may or may not be members of the Labour Party. They may or may not be people who are members of trade unions, but who accept this partial transformation of society. How do you work with them in order to achieve goals that both of us want to achieve, whatever it is, more housing, end to the bedroom tax, any of those, stop the war, any of these kind of things? How do you work with them in order to achieve the particular goals, at the same time, in the process, trying to win sufficient numbers of those people towards a wider critique of what is wrong with society and the need to overthrow it? Now, again, Rosa Luxemburg makes there's 2 points I want to make about how you do this. Rosa Luxemburg makes a very important point about this. That she says that revolutionaries are the best fighters for reforms. And, this is... Now, that might sound a sort of contradiction in terms. Why would you be the person if you think that nothing can be done apart from the transformation of society? Why are you the best fighter for reforms? Well, I think the answer to that is we've all seen socialists, or certainly I've seen lots of socialists, who do only talk about, the abolition of the wages system or all these kind of things. That you only talk about the end goal of revolution, and of course, you have a fairly small audience at the best of times, and at other times you have practically no audience at all. So if you're just doing that, then you're cutting yourself off from a much bigger audience of working class people who actually want to know what to do in the here and now. What do they do about low wages? What do they do about unemployment? What do they do about the ecological crisis? What do they do about any of these questions? And there has to be things that you say to them. So the first thing is you have to be the people who are prepared to be the best fighters for reforms, and precisely because you have a view of society, you understand the nature of the state, you understand the nature of capitalism, you understand all these things, you actually do understand in the best way how it is that you can fight and win over particular issues. And that is a point that she makes at the time. The second thing is the crucial way of doing this is through the mechanism of the United Front. Now, the United Front is something that we take from that generation of revolutionary socialists, of which Luxembourg unfortunately was murdered in beginning of 1919 and therefore wasn't able to fully participate in those discussions, was murdered by counter-revolutionaries in Berlin. But Lenin and Trotsky in particular, and the people who formed what was called the Third International, the Communist International, after the First World War, they put a great emphasis on the need for a united front. And why did they do that? They did this because they could see there was a revolutionary wave in the world, but particularly in Europe, after the First World War, very much influenced by the Russian Revolution, but which at the same time, you had people becoming revolutionaries, and at the same time, the reformist workers were only just moving into struggle. So you had a process of changing consciousness where everybody kind of moved to the left, but they did so from different places and at different speeds and so on. And Lenin and Trotsky were very much concerned with the question, how do the most conscious workers, what do they call the vanguard, the people who accepted the need to transform society, did they want to break completely from these people, which was the argument, for example, from the Italian communists at the time, or did they want to find ways of working with these people in practice around a series of issues in order to win over these particular issues, but also in the process to increase the revolutionary section of the working class at the expense of the more cautious or reformist section? And that, the tactic of the United Front, where you unite around specific issues in order to fight around those issues, and in the process, the way in which you fight and your general political approach becomes the most effective, is one which they saw as absolutely central. And Trotsky in particular, obviously, Lenin was dead by then, but Trotsky saw it as absolutely paramount importance with the rise of fascism in Germany. And some of his best writing is on the question of the United Front in Germany, and he's extremely critical of the communists at the time, who were the rather left-wingers, obviously, but were the major far-left, supposedly revolutionary party at the time, and their refusal to engage in activity with the left reformists, the equivalent of the Labour Party, precisely because these were the people who'd been partly responsible for Luxembourg's death and so on and so forth. I mean, there are many things wrong with them, to put it mildly, but Trotsky understood that you had to unite against a much bigger threat, which was the threat of fascism in 1933, without abandoning your principles, without abandoning your independent organisation, but nonetheless you had to work around these specific things. Now, those are the general, it seems to me, the general guidelines, but obviously, again, you know, Trotsky wrote this in the 1930s. We're a long way, well, we're 80 years on from that. A great deal has changed since then. And what's the application for it now when we talk about us as a very small group of people inside the left, and the left in Britain is actually a very small group of people within the working class movement, let alone the population as large, and one which is also very, very fragmented at the moment. How is it you act in order to change things, and how is it you act to bring together the reform and revolutionary wings of the movement in order to change things? Well, that means you have to firstly locate what you think the biggest problem that you can organise around is, and I think all of us would agree that is the question of austerity, the things we've talked about today, the attempts to destroy the welfare state, and all the other things that are going on in Britain at the moment. And the form that takes at the moment, is, which we've come to, and which I think, again, everybody in the room accepts is an absolutely central thing, is the People's Assembly, which is an attempt in every town and city across the country to bring together everybody on the left and everybody who calls themselves, you know, trade unions, not just the far left, but much wider sections of the Labour Party, of the Greens, of all these different sorts of people, but to do even more than that, which is not just to be in a room where we all talk to ourselves, but where we actually begin to engage in forms of mass work, which reach out to the people who by and large aren't the activists in the movement. You know, lots of working class people, particularly women and black and ethnic minority people who aren't particularly involved in trade unions, or although they're members of trade unions, actually disproportionately compared to white men. If you look at the figures and join them in greater numbers proportionally, but they're much less represented when it comes to the activists and the shop stewards and all those kind of people. How do you reach out? And we talk about the People's Assembly as a key way of trying to do this. Now, this has raised all sorts of arguments on the left. Is it a reformist organisation? Are we providing left cover for Len McCluskey, so that we're providing this thing which involves people on the left as well as people who aren't? Well, actually, Len McCluskey is on the left by most people's standards. He's regarded as a raving lefty. I can guarantee you the Daily Express, the Daily Mail, and even quite a lot of the Guardian readers probably think of him in this kind of way. But, you know, he's not left in the sense that we would call ourselves left. He's a Labour Party member, his union is affiliated to the Labour Party. And so there's all these arguments that come up. Is this a reformist organisation? Is it left cover from McCluskey? My argument is very, very simple. Of course, in any mass movement, you will get people. You'll get people with different motives in any mass movement. And in any mass movement, if you have a mass movement, it covers a wide spectrum of people. The crucial question is not whether the People's Assembly is reformist or revolutionary, because the honest answer to that isn't either. It is a vehicle for trying to fight against austerity, and therefore it incorporates people from both these things. But what it is an attempt to bring together these different people and to organise a united front, a united fight, which can then hopefully could bring down the government, which is the aim of what we're trying to do. So in a way, this whole kind of argument, this is reformism, which comes really from people, it strikes me, who don't really understand the united front concept at all and always just think about politics just in terms of your own revolutionary purity. Now, everybody can write down what they believe in. If you only talk to people who agree with absolutely the same thing, or if you only organise with people who agree with absolutely the same thing, you're not going to get very far. I mean, that's simply a fact. So you have to find ways of reaching out to doing it. And that's what we're trying to do with the People's Assembly. There's one other point that I want to bring in before I end, which is, of course, the points that were made in earlier discussions about the nature of neoliberalism and what it's done to traditional reformist organisations is very, very important in this. It's very much weakened the unions. It's weakened the traditional left reformist parties. In some countries, these are extremely weak. Not that the Greek one, for example, PASOK, was not particularly strong party in the first place and wasn't particularly... it's fairly recent development, certainly compared to the Labour Party or the SPD in Germany. But what you've had is a weakening of all those main left parties, essentially because they accept the main tenets of neoliberalism, even though they want to carry out the worst effect of it slower and more humanely and so on and so forth. They accept all this. So what you've had has been a splintering of the reformist organisations, and in some countries you have now very significant organisations which have broken to the left of the reformists. Syriza is the most famous, I suppose, the most obvious and probably the biggest, the one in Greece, which is the second or maybe even the first biggest according to some of the opinion polls, which is obviously is well placed in terms of elections in Greece in the future, and which is a break from traditional reformism. Nonetheless, will incorporate within its ranks people who probably have very similar politics to us and people who are much closer to traditional reformist politics. And I think its attitude to the EU and its attitude to the Euro actually reflects a much more kind of reformist approach to things. In Germany, although not on the same significance, but Die Linke, which is an amalgam of sort of left SPD people who broke with when Oscar Lafontaine did, along with the PDS, which is the old Communist Party in the East, the former DDR in East Germany. Die Linke has posed, although I don't think it's going to do particularly well in these elections, but has posed quite a significant threat to the SPD from the left. Rifondazione did the same in Italy, although has spectacularly collapsed. So, so these things aren't always necessarily as stable. In fact, they're probably never a particularly stable entity. Nonetheless, they represent a very important development. Now, what should our attitude be to these? Well, the reason I raise this is because there's some... The point that is made about the cover for left reformism, and the point that was made as a speech at Marxism the other week, that this is, supporting Syriza, or Syriza, the People's Assembly, Len McCluskey, Owen Jones, and all these other people, who actually are a combination of kind of left reformism and in some cases closer to what we would call revolutionary socialism, a term which is historically defined as centrism in the left movement, although that may not be a particularly helpful term to introduce at this phase of the thing. But, you know, these are people who are left reformists. Now, some people see these people as the main enemy. It seems to me that is a really stupid way of looking at it, to tell the truth. And we have to look at it in terms of, yes, it is true that the divisions between reformism and revolutionary socialism are very deep divisions if you look historically. Yes, it is true that when it comes to the question of can we achieve socialism, there will be very fundamental differences between us and between many of these people. Is it true in the situation in which we are now, when the working class is on the defensive, and hello, you might not have noticed, but there is a Tory government in this country, is it the case that left reformism will be essentially a positive development in that sense, in the sense that it means that certain people are saying we are wanting to organise against austerity? And therefore surely the job of revolutionaries is to welcome the development of people who are doing these kind of things, who are saying we don't accept what Labour is doing. I think the whole row between McCluskey and Ed Miliband is a very significant row over the question of the Labour link, which will probably be papered over until after the next election, although you can never be absolutely certain about these things. But I think marks a further deterioration in the relationship between the trade unions and Labour in this country. And you have to say as well that lots of the other things that unions like Unite are doing are very positive in terms of supporting strikes, in terms of community membership, in terms of being very supportive of the People's Assembly in all sorts of different ways. Seems to me this is exactly the terrain the left ought to be wanting to get onto at the moment, and should be arguing that within that, within a big group of people who want to fight austerity, we can put our particular demands, our particular arguments, our particular way of doing things. It seems to me that is the tradition of the United Front, that is the spirit of the United Front that we really ought to be embracing, and that is the way that we should look at these developments. The same is true in Greece, that whatever the faults of Syriza, it's a very important development, particularly when you have the rise of fascism, you know, very, very hard-line fascism in Greece in the shape of Golden Dawn, that you do have an organisation which groups together a lot of left. I think there are massive contradictions within Syriza, which I'm sure will come out, certainly not least if they do form a government or part of a government. I think that's absolutely clear. Nonetheless, the idea that somehow this is the main enemy in the present situation, it seems to me, is just wrong, and it goes and reduces the revolutionary left to standing on the sidelines and commenting on everything rather than actually building a movement against austerity.